The papers lay on the desk between them, and Alina did not reach for a handkerchief. Nathaniel Ashford, Duke of Kentmore, had rehearsed this moment for 3 weeks. He had imagined tears, perhaps a raised voice, perhaps a plea. He had prepared himself to remain firm against all of it. What he had not prepared for was silence. "You sent for me," Alina said, standing just inside the study door. Her voice was even, almost pleasant, as though he had called her in to discuss the household accounts rather than the end of their marriage. "Sit down, Alina." "I would rather stand." He studied her for a moment, this woman who had shared his table and his name for 3 years, and found that he could not read her expression at all. That unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. He pushed the papers across the polished wood. "These are the documents," he said. "My solicitor drew them up. Everything is arranged fairly. You will keep the townhouse in Belmore until other arrangements suit you, and you will want for nothing." Alina crossed the room without hurry. She picked up the papers and read them every line while he watched her face for some crack in her composure. There was none. When she finished, she set them down again, neat and squared at the corners, exactly as they had been. "Is this truly what you want, Nathaniel?" The question caught him off guard, though he did not let it show. He had expected her to ask why, or to ask what she had done wrong, or to beg him to reconsider. He had not expected her to ask about his wishes, as though her own did not matter at all, or as though she had already made peace with whatever answer he gave. "It is," he said, because it was easier to say than the truth, which was that he did not know what he wanted anymore, only that he could not go on the way things were. Alina nodded once slowly and picked up the pen from its stand on his desk. She did not hesitate. She did not ask for a moment to think, or a day, or an hour. She signed her name at the bottom of the page in the same steady hand she used for letters to her aunt in Sussex, and then she set the pen down beside the papers with a small, quiet click against the wood. Nathaniel felt something shift in his chest, though he could not have named it. He had expected this to feel like victory, or at least like relief. Instead, it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff he had not noticed approaching. "Is there anything else?" Alina asked. "No, that is all." She turned to leave, and then, as if remembering something small and unimportant, she stopped. She looked down at her left hand, at the ring he had placed there on their wedding day, a ring that had belonged to his grandmother and her grandmother before that, a ring that had seen 4 generations of Ashford brides. She slid it from her finger without ceremony and placed it on the desk, on top of the signed papers, where it caught the afternoon light through the tall windows. "This belongs to your family," she said, "not to me." Nathaniel stared at the ring. He had given it to her with his own hands 3 years ago, in a chapel full of people who had called them a fine match, a sensible match, a match that would settle old debts and old rivalries between 2 great houses. He had never once, in 3 years, thought about what would happen to that ring if the marriage ended. He had not thought that far ahead at all. "Alina," but she was already walking toward the door, her back straight, her steps unhurried, and something about the way she moved told him plainly that she would not turn around again. The door closed behind her with a soft, final click, no louder than the pen had been when she set it down. Nathaniel sat alone in his study for a long time after that. The autumn light moved slowly across the floor, and somewhere in the house he could hear the ordinary sounds of a household going about its business, unaware that anything had changed. A maid's footsteps in the hall, the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen. The world continued exactly as it had before, and yet nothing in his study felt the same. He looked at the ring for a long time before he picked it up. It was warm still, warm from her hand, and that small detail struck him harder than anything she had said. He turned it over between his fingers, remembering the weight of it when he had first placed it on her finger, remembering how her hand had trembled slightly that day, though her face had shown nothing but calm acceptance of the life laid out before her. He had told himself over these past weeks that ending the marriage was an act of mercy. He had told himself that Alina deserved a husband who could love her properly, who could give her his whole heart instead of the guarded, careful half of it he had offered her since the day they married. He had told himself that setting her free was the kindest thing he could do, because he knew what it was to live beside someone who held part of themselves back, and he did not want that for her. He had built the entire decision on the belief that she was unhappy, that she longed for something he could not give her, and that releasing her from their contract was a gift. But she had not wept, she had not argued, she had not looked at him the way a woman looks at a man she is losing. She had looked at him the way a person looks at a chapter they have already closed in their mind long before the final page was written, and that realization sat in his stomach like a stone. Frederick Lang, his steward, knocked and entered a few minutes later, carrying the estate ledgers Nathaniel had asked for that morning. He stopped in the doorway when he saw his employer sitting motionless behind the desk, the ring resting in his open palm. "Your Grace, shall I return later?" Nathaniel closed his fingers around the ring. "No, come in, Frederick." Frederick set the ledgers down and hesitated, glancing at the signed papers still lying on the desk, at the space where the ring had been. He had served the household long enough to understand what he was looking at, though he said nothing about it directly. "Her Grace has asked that a carriage be arranged for tomorrow morning," Frederick said carefully, "to take her to her brother's house in Thornfield." "So soon?" "She did not wish to delay, Your Grace. She said there was no reason to." Nathaniel nodded, though the words landed with more weight than he expected. No reason to delay. As though she had been waiting for this moment, packed and ready in her heart long before he had ever called her into this room. He wondered, with a discomfort he did not like, how long she had known this day was coming, and how long she had prepared herself for it while he had only just begun to understand what he was giving away. "See that she has everything she needs for the journey," he said. "The carriage, an escort, whatever she requires." "Of course, Your Grace." Frederick left him alone again, and Nathaniel sat with the ring in his hand until the light in the room turned from gold to gray. He told himself that this feeling in his chest, this strange hollow pressure that had not been there this morning, was simply the natural weight of a difficult decision, nothing more. He told himself he would feel better once the arrangements were finished, once Alina had gone to Thornfield and the house had settled into its new quiet rhythm. He did not yet understand that the quiet he was imagining would not feel like peace at all. He did not yet understand that some decisions, once made, cannot be taken back simply because a man wishes to feel the way he expected to feel and does not. He set the ring down on the desk, beside the papers, and for the first time in 3 years, he found that he could not stop thinking about his wife. Alina did not cry until she reached her own bedroom, and even then, only for a moment, quietly, with the door locked and her back pressed against it, as though she could hold the day outside if she just stood firm enough. Then she wiped her face, straightened her shoulders, and began to pack. She did not take much. A few dresses she had brought with her before the marriage, a small box of letters from her mother, a worn copy of a novel she had read a dozen times as a girl. She left behind the jewelry the Ashford family had given her, the fine gowns commissioned for balls she had attended as Duchess, the silver hairbrush engraved with her married initials. None of it, she told herself, had ever truly belonged to her. It belonged to a role she had played for 3 years, and the role had ended that afternoon in the study downstairs. Her lady's maid, a young woman named Isabel who had served her since the wedding, found her folding a shawl into a small trunk and stopped in the doorway, her eyes already red. "Your Grace, surely you don't mean to leave with so little." "I mean to leave with what is mine, Isabel. Nothing more. But the house in Belmore, His Grace said you may keep it and all the—" "I know what he said." Alina folded the shawl a second time, though it did not need it, simply to give her hands something to do. "I will decide what to do with the house later. Tonight, I am going to my brother's home in Thornfield, and I do not need a trunk full of a life I no longer have." Isabel helped her anyway, quietly, folding what little there was with careful hands, and neither of them spoke again of what had happened in the study. But as she worked, Alina's mind returned, unbidden, to the early days of her marriage, days she had not allowed herself to think about in a long while. She remembered arriving at Kentmore Hall as a bride of 19, nervous and hopeful despite knowing the marriage had been arranged to settle a debt between their two families. Her father had owed money to Nathaniel's father, an old and complicated debt tangled up in a failed shipping venture, and the marriage had solved it neatly, the way such marriages so often did among families with more pride than fortune. She had not resented it, not truly. She had gone into it believing, as many young women did, that affection could grow where duty had planted the first seed. For a time, she had believed it was growing. Nathaniel had been courteous in those early months, attentive in the careful way of a man raised to perform his duties well. He had shown her the gardens himself, had asked after her comfort, had sat with her at dinner and asked about her family, her interests, her opinions on the running of the household. She had thought in her hopeful 19-year-old heart that warmth would follow courtesy the way summer follows spring. But something in him had remained closed, a door she could see the outline of but never find the handle for. She noticed it first in small things. The way his eyes would drift toward the window during quiet evenings, as though searching for something beyond the glass. The way he sometimes called her by the wrong name in his sleep, a name that was not hers, though he never spoke of it and she never asked. The way he flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever a letter arrived bearing a particular seal, a seal she did not recognize and he never explained. She had tried in those first 2 years to reach him. She had learned to manage the estate accounts so she might discuss them with him as an equal rather than a decoration at his table. She had nursed his mother, Margaret, through a long illness that winter, sitting up through cold nights with cool cloths and warm broth long after the physicians had given up hope of a swift recovery. She had done it not for praise, though praise had come, but because she believed that a shared life meant sharing its burdens, and she had hoped that Nathaniel would see, in her devotion to his mother, some reflection of the devotion she wished to offer him. Margaret had recovered slowly, and had grown to love Elinor as a daughter in those long months of care. But Nathaniel had only grown quieter, more distant, as though her efforts to draw close to him only reminded him of some distance he could not close from his own side. Elinor had found the letter by accident in the 2nd year of their marriage, tucked into an old book in the library. She had been dusting herself one rainy afternoon when the staff were occupied elsewhere. It was addressed to Nathaniel, dated years before their wedding, signed only with the name Beatrice. She had not read it fully. A single line had been enough to tell her everything she needed to know. That Nathaniel had loved someone before her, deeply, in the way she had hoped he might one day love her, and that whatever had happened to end that love had left a wound he had never allowed to heal. She had never mentioned the letter to him. What good would it have done? A woman cannot compete with a name that carries the weight of grief rather than mere memory, and Elinor had sensed, even then, that whatever Beatrice had meant to him was tied not to romance alone, but to loss, the kind of loss that closes a man's heart the way a burned house closes its doors against further fire. She had decided, in her quiet way, to simply keep loving him as best she could and hope that patience would do what questions could not. It had not. The years had worn on, gentle on the surface, hollow underneath. They had attended balls together, hosted dinners together, sat at the same table every evening and slept in the same wing of the house. And yet Elinor had come to understand, slowly and painfully, that she was married to a man who had built a wall around himself long before she arrived, and that no amount of devotion on her part would ever be enough to bring it down if he himself refused to lift a single stone. By the 3rd year she had stopped trying so hard, not out of bitterness, but out of a kind of exhausted honesty with herself. She had begun, in small private ways, to imagine a life apart from Kentmore Hall, though she had never spoken the thought aloud, not even to Charlotte, her closest friend, who wrote to her from Belmore every fortnight with news of the outside world Elinor had slowly grown distant from. So when Nathaniel had called her into his study that afternoon, and she had seen the papers laid out upon his desk, she had felt something she had not expected to feel, not devastation, but a strange and quiet relief, as though a held breath had finally been allowed to leave her chest. She finished packing before nightfall. Isabel wept as she said her farewells, promising to write, though Elinor gently reminded her that a new duchess would likely be chosen for the household staff soon enough, and that Isabel's loyalty need not follow her into a life that could offer far less than Kentmore Hall had once provided. "I don't care about that, Your Grace," Isabel said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "You were kind to all of us, kinder than most in your position ever bothered to be." Elinor squeezed her hand and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not bring the tears back to her own eyes, and she had promised herself, walking out of that study, that she would not let this day undo her. The carriage arrived at dawn the next morning, exactly as Frederick had promised. Elinor descended the front steps of Kentmore Hall for what she believed would be the last time, her small trunk loaded by a footman who would not meet her eyes, and she did not look back at the house as the carriage pulled away down the long gravel drive lined with elm trees she had watched change color 3 autumns in a row. She thought, as the countryside rolled past the window, that grief for a marriage was a strange thing. It did not always arrive as sorrow for what had been lost. Sometimes it arrived as a quiet, aching mourning for what had never been given the chance to exist at all. Thornfield was smaller than Kentmore by every measure that mattered to society. A modest stone house with a garden her mother had once tended, and her brother Henry now let grow half-wild in his bachelor negligence. When the carriage pulled up the short drive, Henry himself came out to meet her, his face already tight with the particular anger of an older brother who has heard only half the story and imagined the rest far worse. "I ought to ride to Kentmore this very hour and demand an explanation," he said, before she had even stepped fully out of the carriage. "You will do no such thing, Henry. Elinor, he cast you aside as though you were nothing to him. After everything you did for that family, for his mother." "He did not cast me aside." Elinor took her brother's offered arm and let him lead her toward the house, her voice calm despite the ache still sitting beneath her ribs. "He ended a marriage that had already ended in every way that mattered long before those papers were drawn up. I signed them because there was nothing left to sign away." Henry studied her for a long moment, his anger slowly giving way to something gentler, something closer to the worry of a brother who had watched his sister go quietly, bravely, into a marriage neither of them had chosen, and who had wondered ever since whether she had found any real happiness within it. "You could have wept," he said finally. "No one would have thought less of you for it." Elinor allowed herself a small, tired smile as they stepped through the front door into the familiar smell of wood smoke and old books that had always meant home to her, long before Kentmore Hall had ever tried to claim that word for itself. "I have done enough weeping for one lifetime, Henry," she said. "What I need now is not tears. What I need now is somewhere to begin again." Nathaniel had not always been a cold man. He had simply become one, slowly, in the way frost creeps across a window overnight without anyone watching it happen. He had been 23 when he met Beatrice Sinclair at a garden party in Larkspur, the daughter of a modest landowner with no title and less fortune, and he had loved her with the reckless, complete devotion of a young man who had never yet been taught that love and duty could pull in opposite directions. For 2 years they had planned a future together in secret, meeting in the orchard behind her father's house, exchanging letters carried by a trusted groundskeeper, dreaming of a wedding his own father would never permit. His father had found out, of course. Fathers with titles and debts always did. There had been a terrible argument, threats of disinheritance, and in the end, Nathaniel, only 25 and not yet Duke, had done what young men in his position so often did. He had waited, hoping time would soften his father's resolve, hoping some solution would present itself that did not require him to choose between the woman he loved and the family that had raised him. The solution never came. Instead, a fever swept through Larkspur that winter, the kind that took the young and the old with equal cruelty, and Beatrice had died before he could reach her, before he could tell her that he had finally decided, whatever the cost, to choose her over everything his father demanded of him. He had arrived at her father's house 3 days after the funeral, having been away on his father's business and not told of her illness until it was already too late, and he had stood in that empty orchard where they had once made their quiet plans and understood, for the first time, what it meant to lose something before you had the courage to fight properly to keep it. He had never told anyone the full truth of it, not even his mother. He had simply returned to Kentmore Hall a different man, closed and careful, determined never again to let hope build a future he could not protect. When his father arranged the marriage to Elinor Hartley 2 years later, he had agreed without protest, telling himself that duty was a safer foundation than love had ever been, that a marriage built on obligation could not break his heart the way love had, because he would simply never allow his heart to be part of the arrangement at all. He had not counted on Elinor's quiet persistence. He had not counted on the particular way she hummed to herself while working in the garden, unaware anyone was listening. He had not counted on the nights she sat up with his mother through fever and delirium, asking nothing in return, or the careful, thoughtful questions she asked him about the estate ledgers, questions that showed a mind far sharper than society ever gave young brides credit for. He had felt himself, more than once in those 3 years, drawn toward the warmth she offered, and each time he had pulled back, afraid of what it might cost him if he let himself hope again and lost. The anniversary of Beatrice's death fell each year in late autumn, and each year Nathaniel disappeared into himself for a week or more, distant and short-tempered, unable to explain why. In the 2nd year of his marriage, Elinor had planned a small dinner for their own wedding anniversary, which fell only days after, and he had forgotten it entirely, sitting alone in his study long after the appointed hour while she waited in the dining room in a gown she had chosen with particular care, the candles burning low before she finally rose and told the staff to clear the table. She had never mentioned it again. She had never asked why he had forgotten or accused him of neglect, and her silence on the matter had somehow made him feel worse than any argument could have. He had told himself, in the days that followed, that he owed her an explanation, that he ought to tell her about Beatrice and the orchard and the fever that had taken everything he could not bring himself to fight for in time. But the longer he waited, the harder the telling became, until the silence between them grew into something too large to cross with words at all. The final incident, the one that had finally pushed him toward the solicitor's office and the papers on his desk, had happened only a month before. His mother, recovered fully from her illness and sharper than ever in her observations, had found him alone in the library one evening, staring at an old letter he had not meant for anyone to see. "You still grieve for her," Margaret had said, not as a question but as a simple statement of fact, and Nathaniel had not bothered to deny it. "I do not know how to stop," he had admitted, the words coming easier to his mother than they ever had to Elinor, perhaps because his mother had already guessed the shape of his sorrow long before he confirmed it. "And I cannot ask a wife to live beside a man who carries another woman's memory like a stone in his chest. It is not fair to her, mother. She deserves better than half a husband." Margaret had studied him with the particular patience of a woman who had buried a husband of her own and understood grief better than most. "Have you asked Elinor what she deserves, Nathaniel, or have you simply decided it for her?" He had not answered, because he had not liked the question, and he had spent the following weeks convincing himself that ending the marriage was an act of kindness rather than a failure of courage. He had told himself that Elinor would be relieved to be free of him, that she would find happiness elsewhere, with a man capable of giving her what he could not. He had built an entire justification around the idea that she was as unhappy as he was, that releasing her was a gift rather than an abandonment. Sitting alone in his study on the evening after she left, the ring cold now in a small dish on his desk where he had finally set it down, he began to understand how badly he had misjudged the entire situation. Elinor had not looked relieved when she signed those papers. She had not looked like a woman being freed from a cage. She had looked like a woman who had already grieved this marriage privately, in her own quiet way, long before he found the courage to end it, and that realization sat far heavier on him than he had expected. He thought of the letter from Beatrice he still kept, folded and worn soft from handling, tucked into the same book Elinor had once dusted without his knowledge. He thought of the anniversary he had forgotten, the dinner gone cold, the years of small kindnesses Alina had offered him that he had accepted without ever truly returning. He thought of his mother's question, still unanswered after all these weeks, and for the first time he allowed himself to consider it honestly. Have you asked Alina what she deserves, or have you simply decided it for her? He had decided it for her. He had spent 3 years deciding, quietly and without her knowledge, that his grief for Beatrice made him unworthy of a real marriage, and he had never once given Alina the chance to decide for herself whether she wanted to stay and fight for something more, or whether she wanted the freedom he had assumed she craved. He had taken that choice from her the same way his father had once taken the choice from him, deciding what was best for someone else's heart without ever asking what that heart truly wanted. The thought sat with him through the night, unwelcome and persistent, and by the time dawn broke over Kentmore Hall, he understood that he had made a terrible mistake, though he did not yet know whether it was one he could undo. His mother found him at breakfast the next morning, unshaven and hollow-eyed, staring at a plate he had not touched. She said nothing at first, simply took her seat across from him and poured her own tea, watching him with the patient eyes of a woman who had raised him from a boy who once believed love was worth any risk into a man who had forgotten that lesson somewhere along the way. "She left before dawn yesterday," Margaret said finally. "Frederick tells me she went to her brother's house without complaint, without argument, and without asking for a single thing beyond what was hers to begin with." "I know. You look as though you have not slept." "I have not." Margaret set down her teacup with a soft, deliberate click. "Then perhaps, Nathaniel, you have finally begun to understand what you gave away." He did not answer her, because there was nothing he could say that would undo the papers already signed, already filed, already carried by messenger to the appropriate offices in London, where such matters were made official and binding. He had asked for his freedom from a marriage he believed had trapped them both, and now he sat in the wreckage of that decision, understanding too late that the trap had never been the marriage at all, but the wall he had built around his own heart long before Alina Hartley had ever walked through the doors of Kentmore Hall. Outside, the autumn wind stripped the last leaves from the elm trees lining the drive, and Nathaniel Ashford, Duke of Kentmore, sat in the quiet ruin of a house that suddenly felt far too large and far too empty, and began, for the first time in years, to grieve for something other than the woman he had lost in Larkspur so long ago. The days that followed settled over Kentmore Hall like a fog that refused to lift. Nathaniel moved through his duties with the same outward efficiency he always had, signing correspondence, meeting with tenants, reviewing the harvest reports Frederick brought him each week, but those who knew him well could see that something essential had gone quiet inside him, the way a clock still ticks after its chime has broken. The staff noticed it too, though none of them spoke of it directly in his presence. Alina had been well loved among them, not because she demanded it, but because she had never once treated the running of the household as beneath her notice, as some duchesses did. She had learned the names of every maid and footman within a month of arriving, had asked after their families, had quietly arranged for the cook's ailing father to see a proper physician when she learned of his condition through nothing more than an overheard conversation in the kitchen. Her absence left gaps that no amount of efficient management could fill, small silences where her particular warmth had once lived. Frederick Lang had served the Ashford family for 11 years, first under Nathaniel's father and now under Nathaniel himself, and in that time he had learned when it was his place to remain silent and when it was his place to speak plainly, whatever the cost to his own comfort. 3 weeks after Alina's departure, watching his employer stare blankly at a ledger he had clearly not read a single line of, Frederick decided the time for silence had passed. "Your Grace, if I may speak freely." Nathaniel looked up, surprised by the formality in Frederick's tone. "You may. I have served this family a long time. I served your father, and I watched him make a great many decisions he later regretted, decisions made in haste, out of pride, or out of a fear he never named aloud even to himself." Frederick chose his words carefully, aware of how far he was stepping beyond his usual role. "I do not say this to compare you to him unkindly. I say it because I believe you are standing at the edge of a similar regret, and I would rather speak plainly now than watch you discover it too late, as he so often did. Nathaniel set down his pen. You think I made a mistake. I think, Your Grace, that Her Grace was the finest thing to happen to this house in a great many years, and I think you knew it, in your own quiet way, long before those papers were signed. I have watched you these 3 weeks. You do not look like a man who has been freed from a burden. You look like a man who has lost something he did not fully understand the value of until it was gone. The words landed with more force than Frederick had perhaps intended, and Nathaniel sat in silence for a long moment, turning his pen over between his fingers before he finally spoke. I do not know how to fix what I have broken, Frederick. The papers are filed. The matter is legally settled. Even if I wish to undo it, there is no simple path back to what was. No, Frederick agreed. There is not a simple path, but I have never known a worthwhile thing to come by a simple path, Your Grace. Difficult is not the same as impossible. Nathaniel did not answer that day, but the conversation stayed with him through the following week, returning to him at odd moments, while he rode the boundaries of the estate, while he sat through a tedious meeting with a tenant farmer about drainage rights, while he lay awake at night in a bed that felt far too wide without another presence somewhere in the house. He rode out to Larkspur on a cold morning near the end of the month, telling no one where he was going, not even Frederick. It had been years since he last visited the small churchyard where Beatrice was buried, years since he had allowed himself to walk the overgrown path to the orchard where they had once made their quiet, impossible plans together. He stood before her grave for a long while, the marker weathered now, softened by time and rain, her name barely legible beneath a coat of pale lichen. I built my whole life around not losing anyone else the way I lost you, he said aloud, feeling foolish and yet unable to stop himself. I thought if I never let myself hope again, I could never be hurt this way again. But I think in trying to protect myself, I hurt someone else instead. Someone who never did anything but try to love me well. The wind moved through the bare branches above him, and he stood there a long time, letting the cold settle into his bones, letting himself finally grieve properly for the girl he had loved and lost so young, a grief he had never fully allowed himself in all the years since, choosing instead to simply close a door and never open it again. He understood now, standing in that quiet churchyard, that grief left unspoken does not disappear. It simply waits, patient and heavy, for an unguarded moment to make itself known, and it had chosen the worst possible moment to make itself known in his marriage to Elinor. He rode back to Kentmore Hall that evening feeling lighter in some ways and heavier in others, as though he had finally set down a weight he had carried so long he had forgotten what it felt like to stand without it, only to discover a new weight waiting to take its place. The weight of what he had done to Elinor while carrying the old one. His mother noticed the change in him almost immediately. Margaret had watched her son grow into a careful, guarded man over the years since Beatrice's death, and she recognized, in the weeks following Elinor's departure, the first real cracks in that careful armor she had seen in a very long time. "You went to Larkspur," she said one evening, not quite a question, as they sat together in the drawing-room after dinner, a meal Nathaniel had barely touched. "How did you know?" A mother knows more than her children give her credit for. Margaret set aside her needlework and looked at him directly, the way she had not done in years, as though she had been waiting patiently for him to become ready to hear her properly. "Did it help?" "I think it did. I think I needed to say goodbye to her properly, something I never managed to do when she died. I spent so many years grieving in silence that I never noticed how much of myself I was giving up in the process." "And Elinor?" Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. "I do not know what to do about Elinor. I have wronged her, Mother, in ways I am only beginning to understand. I decided without ever asking her that she deserved better than a man who could not fully love her, and in doing so I never gave her the chance to decide for herself what she wanted. I took that choice from her the way Father once took choices from me, and I did it believing I was being kind." Margaret reached across the small distance between their chairs and took her son's hand, an unusual gesture for a woman raised in a household that valued restraint above almost everything else. But she had learned, through her own long widowhood, that restraint was not always the same as strength. Elinor sat with me through the worst of my illness, Nathaniel, when I was certain I would not see another spring. She never once complained of the long nights, never once asked for thanks. I have grown to love her as my own daughter, and I confess I have grieved her absence from this house nearly as much as you seem to have, though perhaps in a quieter way. She squeezed his hand gently. If you have truly understood your mistake, then the question is not whether you have wronged her. That much is already plain. The question is what you intend to do about it now. I do not know if there is anything I can do. She signed the papers without hesitation, Mother. She returned the ring without a single tear. Whatever she felt for me, if she felt anything at all in these last years, I think I extinguished it long before that afternoon in my study. Perhaps, Margaret said, or perhaps a woman who has learned, through long and painful experience, that tears chain, nothing has simply stopped wasting them on men who do not deserve them yet. That is not the same as no longer caring, Nathaniel. It may simply mean she has grown tired of caring in a way that was never returned. The words settled into him slowly, the way truth often does, arriving not as a sudden revelation, but as a quiet unfolding of understanding he had perhaps already sensed but not yet allowed himself to fully accept. He thought of Elinor's composure in his study, the steady hand with which she had signed the papers, the careful way she had set the ring down rather than throwing it or weeping over it or begging him to reconsider. He had mistaken that composure for indifference. He wondered now, sitting in the quiet drawing room with his mother's hand still resting over his own, whether he had been wrong about that too. He did not write to Elinor that night, nor the next, nor the one after that. He understood with a clarity that had been slow in coming, that whatever he owed her could not be repaid with a letter written in haste, born of guilt rather than genuine understanding. If he meant to make things right, he would need to become, in truth, the man he had only ever pretended to be during their courtship all those years ago, a man capable of opening the doors he had kept locked for so long. And that, he knew, would take more than a single conversation or a single gesture. It would take time and patience, and the kind of honest effort he had never once given their marriage while it still existed. So he began, quietly and without announcement, to change. Thornfield was quieter than Kentmore Hall in nearly every way, and Elinor found, to her own surprise, that she welcomed the quiet rather than dreading it. For the first weeks, she simply allowed herself to rest, to walk the overgrown garden paths her mother had once tended, to sit by the fire in the evenings with Henry and speak of small, ordinary things that had nothing to do with estates or titles or the careful performance of a life she had never quite fit into as comfortably as she had pretended. Charlotte Bell arrived within a fortnight of hearing the news, traveling 2 full days from Belmore with barely a pause to rest, and swept into Thornfield's modest parlor with the particular energy of a lifelong friend who refuses to let sorrow settle too deeply into someone she loves. "I have brought no sympathy and no pity," Charlotte announced, setting down her travel bag and pulling off her gloves with brisk efficiency. "Only myself, and I intend to stay until you have either laughed properly or thrown something at me in frustration, whichever comes first." Elinor, despite herself, laughed for the first time in weeks, a real laugh that surprised her with how easily it came. "You have always had a talent for saying the exact wrong thing at precisely the right moment, Charlotte. It is my finest quality. Now tell me everything, and do not leave out a single detail, because Henry's letter told me almost nothing useful beyond the fact that you signed papers and left before dawn, which frankly sounds like the plot of a novel rather than an actual account of events." They talked long into that first evening, and Elinor found herself speaking more honestly about her marriage than she had allowed herself to speak with anyone in 3 years, not out of disloyalty to Nathaniel, but because she had finally reached a place where the truth no longer felt dangerous to say aloud. Charlotte listened without judgment, offering neither easy comfort nor easy blame, and by the time the fire had burned low, Elinor felt lighter than she had in longer than she could remember. It was Charlotte, in fact, who first suggested the idea that would come to shape the following months of Aliner's life. Over breakfast one morning, nearly 3 weeks into her stay, she mentioned almost in passing that the small textile shop in Thornfield's village center had closed its doors the previous spring, its elderly owner having passed with no family willing to continue the trade. "It sits empty still," Charlotte said, buttering her toast without looking up. "Old Mrs. Fairweather's shop, such a shame. She had the finest embroidery work in the county, and now the building simply gathers dust." Aliner set down her teacup slowly. She had always loved fine needlework, a skill her own mother had taught her as a girl, though it had become little more than an idle pastime during her years at Kentmore Hall, something to occupy quiet afternoons rather than a pursuit taken seriously. She thought of the designs she had sketched over the years and never shown to anyone, patterns inspired by the gardens at Kentmore, by the wildflowers along the country lanes, by the particular quality of light that fell through church windows on winter mornings. "Do you think," she said slowly, "that a woman in my position could take on a trade like that?" Charlotte looked up sharply, sensing immediately that she had stumbled onto something important. "I think a woman in your position could do a great many things society has spent years telling her she couldn't. Why do you ask?" Aliner did not answer immediately, turning the idea over carefully in her mind, examining it from every angle the way she had once examined estate ledgers, searching for flaws before committing to a plan. But the more she considered it, the more the idea took hold of her, growing steadier and more certain with each passing hour. She visited the empty shop that very afternoon, walking through its dusty rooms with Henry at her side, running her fingers along the worn wooden counter where Mrs. Fairweather had once cut fabric and taken measurements for half the village. The building needed work, certainly, new shelving and proper lighting and a fresh coat of paint on the walls, but the bones of it were sound, and the location, just off the village square, was better than she could have hoped for. "You truly mean to do this?" Henry said, watching her survey the space with an intensity he had not seen in her since before her wedding, when she had still been young enough to believe her own opinions mattered as much as anyone else's. "I do. I have some money of my own, Henry, separate from anything Nathaniel offered me in the settlement. My mother left me a small inheritance years ago that I never touched during my marriage. I believe it is enough to begin, if I am careful. And the settlement itself, the house in Belmore, everything he offered." Aliner considered this for a long moment, standing in the dusty light of the empty shop. "I will write to him. I will tell him I have no wish to keep the Belmore house, that I would rather he sell it and put the funds toward something useful, perhaps the tenant cottages I know need repair. I do not want to build my new life on the foundations of the old one, Henry. I want to build it myself from the ground up, with my own 2 hands." Henry studied his sister for a long moment, something like pride mixing with his lingering worry. "You have changed since you left that house." "I have simply remembered who I was before I entered it," Aliner said quietly. "It only took losing everything to find her again." The work of restoring the shop occupied the following weeks entirely. Aliner hired 2 local women, sisters named Grace and Alice Whitmore, whose skilled hands with a needle had gone underused since Mrs. Fairweather's passing, and together the 3 of them began transforming the dusty rooms into something bright and welcoming. Aliner herself designed the shop's first collection, drawing on years of quietly observed patterns and colors, embroidered handkerchiefs and table linens and christening gowns, unlike anything the village had seen before, elegant without being ostentatious, the kind of fine work one might find in London shops, but offered at prices the local families could actually afford. Word spread slowly at first, then more quickly, as it always does in small communities where every new venture is discussed over market stalls and church pews alike. Within 2 months, the shop had a steady stream of customers, not only from Thornfield itself but from the surrounding villages, drawn by both the quality of the work and, though no one said it quite so plainly, a certain curiosity about the woman behind it, the former Duchess of Kentmore who had traded silk gowns and grand estates for a needle and thread and a shop of her own making. It was through the shop that Alina first met William Carter, a merchant from the nearby market town, who supplied fine fabrics to shops across the county, and had heard, through his usual trade channels, of the new establishment in Thornfield producing embroidery work of unusual quality. He arrived one autumn morning with samples of imported silk and linen, expecting to find a small, struggling operation in need of his generosity, and instead found himself genuinely impressed by the sharp, practical questions Alina asked about thread counts and fabric weights and fair pricing structures. "You know a great deal about trade for a woman who was, until recently, a duchess," William observed, not unkindly, as they concluded their business over tea in the small office at the back of the shop. "I managed a great estate's accounts for 3 years, Mr. Carter. Fabric and thread are simply numbers in a different form." He laughed, genuinely amused, and something in his easy manner put her instantly at ease in a way she had not expected. William Carter was perhaps 10 years older than Alina, widowed young and never remarried, a man who had built his own modest fortune through careful trade rather than inherited privilege, and he treated her from that very first meeting not as a curiosity or a fallen aristocrat to be pitied, but simply as a capable businesswoman worth doing honest trade with. Their professional relationship grew steadily over the following weeks into something like friendship, William making regular trips to Thornfield ostensibly to discuss fabric orders, but staying longer each time than business strictly required, sharing tea and conversation with Alina in the quiet hours after the shop closed. He never pressed her for details of her former marriage, never asked the questions the rest of the county seemed so hungry to have answered, and Alina found herself grateful for his discretion, grateful for a friendship that asked nothing of her except her honest company. "You have built something remarkable here," William told her one evening in early winter, as they sat together reviewing the shop's growing ledger by candlelight, the numbers climbing steadily each month in a way that filled Alina with a satisfaction she had never quite felt during her years at Kentmore Hall. "Most women in your position would have retreated quietly into whatever comfortable arrangement was offered them. You chose to build something entirely your own instead. I did not have much choice in the matter, Mr. Carter. A woman learns quickly what she is capable of when the alternative is simply disappearing into someone else's shadow for the rest of her life." "William," he corrected gently, "I think we have known each other long enough now to dispense with such formality." Alina smiled genuinely and found that she meant it. William, then. She did not think of Nathaniel often during those busy, satisfying months, though he crossed her mind occasionally in quiet moments, usually late at night when the shop was closed and the ledgers were balanced, and there was nothing left to occupy her hands or her thoughts. She wondered sometimes whether he had found the peace he had seemed to seek in ending their marriage. She wondered whether his mother had recovered fully, whether the gardens at Kentmore still bloomed the way they had each spring, whether the staff she had grown fond of still spoke of her at all. But these thoughts came and went like passing clouds, no longer heavy with the grief they might once have carried, and Alina found, to her own quiet satisfaction, that she was genuinely, steadily building a life she could be proud of, entirely on her own terms. By the time winter settled fully over Thornfield, the shop had become something of a local institution, its embroidered goods sought after well beyond the county's borders, and Alina Hartley, once Duchess of Kentmore, had become known throughout the region not for the marriage she had left behind, but for the sharp, capable, quietly determined woman she had proven herself to be entirely on her own. News travels strangely among the great houses of the county, passing through channels that have little to do with formal announcements and everything to do with servants' gossip, chance meetings at church, and the letters exchanged endlessly between women who consider themselves keepers of the social record. By midwinter, the story of Alina Hartley's shop had reached well beyond Thornfield's borders, carried along the same routes that had once carried whispers of her divorce, though the tone of the talk had shifted considerably from what it had been in those first weeks. Where once the county had spoken of the former Duchess with a certain pitying curiosity, wondering what she had done to lose her husband's favor, wondering how she would manage without the protection of a great house behind her, the talk now carried a different note entirely. Admiration, grudging at first among the older, more traditional families, then increasingly open as her success became impossible to dismiss. A woman who had lost her title and her position within a single afternoon, and who had, within a matter of months, built a thriving trade entirely through her own effort and skill. Margaret heard the reports first through her own correspondence, a network of old friends and distant cousins scattered across the county who wrote to her regularly with news great and small. She read of Aliner's shop with a private satisfaction she did not share with her son at first, uncertain how he would receive such news, uncertain whether it would deepen his regret or simply reopen a wound still raw beneath the surface. But she began writing to Aliner herself that winter, quiet letters exchanged without Nathaniel's knowledge, careful at first, testing whether the connection between them might survive the ending of the marriage that had brought them together. Aliner's replies came warm and genuine, full of news about the shop's progress, careful questions about Margaret's health, no bitterness in them at all toward the family she had left behind, only the particular warmth of a woman who had genuinely loved her mother-in-law and saw no reason to let a legal document sever that bond entirely. "You are corresponding with her?" It was not a question. Nathaniel had found his mother at her writing desk one evening in early spring, a half-finished letter before her, and he recognized Aliner's careful hand on the folded pages already sealed and waiting to be sent. Margaret did not attempt to hide it. "I am. She has become quite successful, Nathaniel, running a shop of her own in Thornfield. Embroidery and fine linens, the sort of work she always had a gift for but never had the freedom to pursue properly while she lived here." Something tightened in Nathaniel's chest at the news, an uncomfortable mixture of pride, and something sharper he did not immediately want to name. "She is well, then." "She is thriving, genuinely thriving from everything she writes to me." Margaret set down her pen and studied her son carefully. "I had wondered in those first weeks after she left whether she might struggle without the protection of this house behind her. I confess I underestimated her considerably. She has built something entirely her own, something no one can take from her the way this family took her marriage." Nathaniel absorbed this in silence, and Margaret, watching the shifting expressions cross his face, decided the moment called for honesty rather than delicacy. "There is more you should know if you truly wish to understand the shape of things. A merchant from the market town, a Mr. William Carter, has become a frequent visitor to her shop. A widower, respectable, kind by all accounts. Aliner writes of him warmly, though carefully, as a woman speaks of a friend she values rather than a suitor she has accepted. But I would not be surprised if that friendship deepened over time, given the chance to do so." The name struck Nathaniel harder than he expected, a jealousy he had no right to feel but felt regardless, sharp and unwelcome, twisting somewhere beneath his ribs. He had given up his claim to Aliner's future the moment he signed those papers, had told himself repeatedly over the following months that whatever life she built now was entirely her own affair, that he had forfeited any right to feelings about who might share it with her. But hearing his mother speak so plainly of another man's growing place in Aliner's life brought the truth of his loss home in a way that weeks of quiet regret had not quite managed to accomplish. "I am glad she has found good friends," he said, though the words came out stiffer than he intended. Margaret regarded him with the particular patience of a mother who has watched her son wrestle with feelings he refuses to properly name. "Are you, Nathaniel, truly?" He did not answer that night, but the conversation lodged itself in him, growing heavier over the following weeks as spring settled over Kentmore Hall, and the gardens Aliner had once tended began their slow return to bloom. He found himself, more than once, standing in those gardens in the early morning hours, remembering the particular way she used to hum while working among the roses, unaware anyone was listening, and wondering whether he had truly changed enough in the month since her departure to deserve even the smallest chance to see her again. Frederick, ever observant, noticed his employer's restlessness growing rather than easing as the weeks passed. "Your Grace, if I may ask, what do you intend to do with the changes you have made these past months?" Nathaniel had, indeed, changed considerably since that cold morning in the Larkspur churchyard. He had written, finally, a full and honest account of Beatrice's death to his mother, breaking a silence he had kept for nearly a decade, and the telling of it had loosened something in him that had been knotted tight for years. He had thrown himself into the estate's affairs with genuine attention rather than mere efficiency, visiting tenants personally rather than relying solely on Frederick's reports, funding the repair of cottages he had neglected for years, and had begun, slowly and awkwardly, learning to speak more openly with his mother about matters he would once have kept carefully locked away. But all of it, he realized, standing in the garden that spring morning, had been undertaken quietly, privately, with no clear purpose beyond becoming a better version of himself. He had not yet decided what, if anything, he intended to do with that changed man, whether he had any right to seek Alina out at all, given everything he had put her through, given the new life she had clearly built without him, and seemed, by every account, genuinely happy within. "I do not know, Frederick," he admitted finally. "I have spent these months trying to become a man worthy of the mistakes I made, but I have not yet found the courage to discover whether that effort means anything at all, or whether it is simply a private penance I am performing for my own conscience, with no bearing on her life whatsoever. Perhaps, Your Grace, the only way to discover the answer is to ask the question directly, rather than continuing to wonder in silence." The chance to do exactly that arrived sooner than Nathaniel expected, in the form of an invitation his mother arranged with a subtlety he did not initially recognize. Margaret had long been a patron of a charitable society that raised funds each spring for the county's poorer families, hosting a gala each year at Kentmore Hall itself. And this year, without consulting her son on the matter, she extended a personal invitation to Alina to attend, both as a former patron of the society herself, and Margaret wrote carefully in her letter, as a woman whose new venture might benefit from the connections such an evening could offer. Alina's reply came a week later, accepting the invitation with a graciousness that gave no indication of hesitation, though whether that ease was genuine or simply well-practiced composure, Margaret could not say for certain. She showed her son the letter only once the arrangements were already settled, watching his face carefully for his reaction. "You invited her here, to this house." "I invited a respected businesswoman of this county to a charitable event she has every right to attend, Nathaniel, given her own history of supporting the same cause during her years as Duchess." Margaret's tone remained perfectly mild, though there was a knowing glint in her eyes that suggested she understood precisely what she had set in motion. "What you choose to do with the opportunity is entirely your own affair." Nathaniel spent the following weeks in a state of quiet, unrelenting apprehension, torn between dreading the evening and counting down toward it with an eagerness he was almost ashamed to admit even to himself. He rehearsed, in the privacy of his own thoughts, a dozen different versions of what he might say to her, should the chance to speak with her actually arise, and discarded each one as either too little or too much, too formal or too raw, until he finally concluded that no rehearsed speech could possibly account for whatever her actual presence in that house again might make him feel. The gala was set for the last evening of spring, and as the date approached, Nathaniel found himself thinking, with an intensity that surprised him even now, that this single evening might be the only chance he would ever have to discover whether the man he had become in her absence was worth anything at all to the woman who had once loved him and left with such quiet, devastating dignity. The evening of the gala arrived warm and clear, the kind of late spring night that seemed to hold its breath before summer's full arrival, and Kentmore Hall blazed with candlelight from every window, its gardens strung with lanterns for guests to wander beneath the flowering trees Alina herself had once helped design. She arrived a little after 8, in a carriage arranged by Charlotte, who had insisted on accompanying her despite Alina's protests that she was perfectly capable of facing this particular evening alone. "You are not facing anything alone tonight," Charlotte had said firmly, helping her into a gown of deep blue silk that suited her far better than any of the pale, fashionable colors she had worn as Duchess. I have known you too long to let you walk back into that house, without at least one person in the room who is entirely on your side." Elinor had not admitted, even to Charlotte, how much her hands trembled as the carriage pulled up the familiar gravel drive, past the elm trees that had watched her leave nearly a year before, toward the great house that had once been her home and now felt, in some strange and complicated way, both entirely foreign and painfully familiar all at once. She steadied herself as the footman opened the carriage door, reminding herself silently of everything she had built in the month since she last walked through those doors, of the shop and its steady success, of the life she had made entirely on her own terms, and she stepped down into the warm evening with her chin lifted and her composure firmly in place. The gala itself unfolded much as such events always did, a swirl of familiar faces and careful conversation, curious glances that Elinor met with steady, unbothered grace, until she found herself, nearly an hour into the evening, standing near the edge of the garden where the crowd had thinned, watching the lanterns sway gently in the evening breeze. "You look well, Elinor." She did not need to turn to know his voice, though a year's absence had not entirely prepared her for how it would still catch somewhere beneath her ribs, the same low, careful tone she remembered from 100 quiet dinners, 100 silent evenings when neither of them had known quite how to bridge the distance between them. She turned slowly and found Nathaniel standing a respectful distance away, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, watching her with an expression she had rarely seen on his face during their marriage, something open and uncertain that made him look, for a moment, far younger than his years. "Nathaniel," she inclined her head politely, the way one greets any acquaintance at a formal gathering, giving nothing away of the complicated tangle of feelings his sudden appearance had stirred in her. "Your mother's gala is as well attended as ever. She tells me your shop has become quite the success. I understand your embroidery work is sought after well beyond Thornfield now." "It is doing well, yes." She studied him carefully, noting the changes a year had wrought, a certain weariness around his eyes that had not been there before, though also, unexpectedly, a softness in his manner she did not remember from their marriage, as though something rigid in him had finally been allowed to bend. "You look different, Nathaniel." "I have tried to become different," he said quietly. "Whether I have succeeded is not for me to judge." An awkward silence settled between them, filled only by the distant music drifting from the house and the low murmur of other guests scattered across the garden. Elinor felt the weight of everything unspoken pressing against the careful composure she had maintained since stepping out of the carriage, and she found herself, despite every instinct urging caution, genuinely curious what he might say if given the chance to say it fully. "Would you walk with me?" Nathaniel asked, gesturing toward the quieter path that wound along the garden's edge, away from the crowd and its curious eyes. "There are things I believe I owe you an explanation for, Elinor, things I should have told you years ago, long before it ever came to signed papers and returned rings." She hesitated only a moment before nodding, and they walked together along the path in silence for several minutes, past the roses she had once tended with her own hands, before Nathaniel finally spoke again, his voice low and careful, as though he had rehearsed these words many times and still found them difficult to say aloud. "Before I met you, I loved a woman named Beatrice Sinclair. We planned to marry in secret against my father's wishes, and before I found the courage to defy him properly, she died of a fever I was not even told about until it was already too late to say goodbye." He kept his eyes on the path ahead as he spoke, unable, it seemed, to look at her directly through the confession. "I never told you this in 3 years of marriage. I let you live beside a man who could not fully give himself to you, and I told myself, for a very long time, that this was simply the price of duty, that a marriage built on obligation could never demand more of me than careful courtesy. I was wrong, Elinor, and I understood how wrong only after it was too late to matter to you." Elinor stopped walking, and he stopped beside her, finally turning to meet her eyes directly. She studied his face for a long moment, searching for something she could not quite name, and found, to her own surprise, that the anger she might once have expected to feel at this belated confession simply was not there, replaced instead by something quieter, more complicated. "I found the letter," she said finally. "Years ago in the library. I never read it fully, but I read enough to understand there was someone before me, someone whose memory you had never let go of. I never asked you about her, Nathaniel, because I did not believe I had any right to compete with grief. But I wish, very much, that you had trusted me enough to tell me yourself, rather than leaving me to guess at the shape of your silence for 3 years. I know, I understand that now, though understanding it now does very little to undo the years I spent failing to give you the honesty you deserved." Nathaniel's voice carried a rawness she had rarely heard from him, even in their most difficult moments together. "I ended our marriage believing I was setting you free from a man incapable of loving you properly, and I never once asked whether that was actually what you wanted, or whether you might have preferred the chance to decide for yourself what you were willing to fight for. I took that choice from you the same way choices had once been taken from me, and I have spent this past year trying to understand how deeply that failure wronged you." Elinor was quiet for a long moment, the evening breeze stirring the hem of her gown, the distant music from the house drifting softly between them. "I am not the same woman who signed those papers without a single tear, Nathaniel. I have built a life this past year that I am genuinely proud of, a life that belongs entirely to me, built by my own hands rather than inherited through marriage or granted by anyone's permission. I will not pretend that life has been without its difficulties, but I will also not pretend I regret the strength I found in building it." "I do not wish for you to regret it," he said quickly. "Whatever else I hope for tonight, I do not wish to diminish what you have built or ask you to set it aside for my sake. I only wanted you to know the truth I should have given you years ago, and to tell you, honestly, that the mistake was entirely mine, born of my own fear and grief, and never anything lacking in you." Elinor studied him a long moment more, weighing the sincerity in his voice against the careful walls she had built around her heart these past months, walls that had allowed her to heal, to grow, to build something genuinely her own without the constant ache of unreturned devotion pulling at her from within. She did not know, standing in that familiar garden under lantern light, whether his belated honesty changed anything real between them, or whether too much had already broken to be mended by a single evening's confession, however sincerely offered. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally, her voice gentle but carrying a firmness that left no room for misunderstanding. "I believe you mean every word of it, Nathaniel, and I am glad, for your own sake, that you have finally allowed yourself to grieve properly and to speak the truth you carried alone for so long. But I cannot simply return to who I was before those papers were signed, as though this past year never happened. I have grown too much, and grown too fond of the woman I have become, to set her aside easily for the sake of an apology, however honest." "I am not asking you to set her aside," Nathaniel said quietly. "I am only asking whether there might be room, somewhere in the life you have built, for a man willing to earn back what he so carelessly threw away, not through grand gestures or hurried promises, but slowly, honestly, in whatever time you might be willing to allow him." Elinor did not answer immediately. She looked past him, toward the great house glowing warm with candlelight against the darkening sky, the house that had once been her home and now felt like a chapter she had genuinely closed, and then back at him, at the uncertain hope written plainly across his face, a hope he seemed to have no confidence in but offered honestly regardless. "I do not know, Nathaniel," she said finally, and there was no cruelty in the words, only honest uncertainty. "I need time to consider what I truly want, separate from whatever guilt or old affection might tempt me to answer too quickly tonight. Can you accept that, without pressing for more than I am able to give right now?" "I can accept whatever answer you eventually give me, Elinor, even if that answer is no. I have no right to expect anything more than the chance to ask the question honestly, after everything I failed to offer you before." She nodded once slowly, and together they walked back toward the lights and music of the gala in a silence that felt, for the first time in a very long while, less like the heavy silence of unspoken grievances, and more like the quiet, uncertain silence of two people standing at the edge of something neither of them could yet name. Nathaniel did not write to her the following week, nor the one after that, though the temptation pulled at him constantly. A dozen half-written letters abandoned in his study, each one either too formal or too desperate to send. He had told Elinor he would accept whatever time she needed, and he understood, with a clarity that had cost him dearly to learn, that honoring that promise meant genuinely giving her the space to decide without the pressure of his constant presence pulling at her attention. Instead, he turned his energy toward the estate itself, continuing the work he had begun in the months since her departure, though now with a different quality to his effort, less like penance and more like genuine purpose. He funded the completion of the tenant cottage repairs, oversaw the planting of a new orchard along the estate's eastern boundary, a small private gesture he did not explain to anyone, though his mother, watching him from her window one afternoon as he walked the rows of young saplings, suspected she understood its meaning well enough. It was Margaret who maintained the thread of connection during those uncertain weeks, her letters to Elinor continuing much as they had before, careful never to press or pry, simply offering the steady warmth of a woman who genuinely cared for her regardless of what came next between her and Nathaniel. Elinor's replies grew, if anything, more thoughtful during this period, and Margaret noticed, reading between the careful lines of her letters, a woman genuinely wrestling with a question she had not expected to face again. 3 weeks after the gala, a small parcel arrived at Kentmore Hall addressed to Nathaniel in Elinor's familiar hand, containing not a letter but a single embroidered handkerchief, finely worked with a pattern of climbing roses that matched, precisely, the roses that grew along the garden wall where they had walked together that evening. There was no note included, nothing to explain the gesture, and Nathaniel turned the small square of fabric over in his hands for a long while, uncertain what meaning, if any, he was meant to take from it. He understood, eventually, that it required no grand interpretation. It was simply a small, quiet acknowledgement that she had thought of him, that the conversation in the garden had left some mark on her as it had on him, and that perhaps, in her own careful way, she was leaving a door open rather than closing it entirely. He did not write back immediately. Instead, weeks later, he sent a reply in kind rather than words. A small collection of rose cuttings from the very bushes she had once tended at Kentmore Hall, carefully packed for the journey to Thornfield, along with a brief note explaining only that he thought her new garden, wherever she had made one, might benefit from a piece of the old. This quiet exchange continued through the summer, neither of them rushing toward any grand declaration, both seeming to understand, without ever discussing it directly, that whatever might be rebuilt between them would need to grow slowly, honestly, through small and genuine gestures rather than sweeping promises neither of them yet trusted fully. Nathaniel visited Thornfield twice that summer, each time announced properly in advance, each time keeping his visits brief and focused on ordinary conversation rather than any attempt to rush toward reconciliation. During the second of these visits, he saw the shop for the first time, standing quietly near the entrance while Elinor helped a customer select fabric for a wedding gown, watching the easy confidence with which she moved through her own space, the genuine warmth she showed her customers, the obvious pride she took in work that belonged entirely to her. He understood, watching her, that whatever happened between them going forward, this life she had built would need to remain hers, untouched by any return to the constraints of the position she had once held as his duchess. "You could simply watch her all day," Charlotte observed dryly, finding him lingering near the doorway after the customer had gone, Elinor busy now with the day's ledgers in the back office. "I am trying to understand how to be worthy of what she has built," Nathaniel admitted, "without asking her to give any of it up for my sake." Charlotte studied him for a long moment, her usual sharp wit softening slightly as she considered his sincerity. "She does not need you to rescue her from anything, Your Grace. She built this life without your help and could continue it without you entirely, should she choose to. If you wish to be part of what comes next, you will need to offer something to add to her life, not something to replace what she has already made for herself. "I understand that," he said quietly. "I am not asking her to return to Kentmore Hall as though nothing happened. I am asking whether there might be a way to build something new between us, something that honors both the life she has made here and whatever future we might still choose together." Alina herself found the visits, brief as they were, more welcome than she had expected. She watched Nathaniel during those quiet hours, noting the genuine interest he took in the shop's practical workings, the questions he asked about her suppliers and her pricing that showed real engagement rather than polite tolerance, the easy way he had begun speaking of his own work restoring the estate's tenant cottages, work that seemed to bring him genuine satisfaction in a way his duties never had during their marriage. He had indeed changed, not through some sudden transformation, but through the slow, deliberate work of a man determined to become someone worth trusting again. Autumn arrived, and with it, the anniversary of that terrible afternoon in his study when she had signed the papers and returned the ring, a date that passed quietly, marked by nothing more than a simple letter from Nathaniel acknowledging the day without dwelling on it, offering instead his genuine hope that the coming year might hold better things for her than the one now ending. It was William Carter, of all people, who first raised the question directly with Alina, arriving at the shop on a cold afternoon in early winter with fabric samples she had not requested and a directness that surprised her. "You have been distracted these past months," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk with the ease of long familiarity. "I do not think it unreasonable to guess the cause, given how often a certain duke's carriage has been seen on the road to Thornfield." Alina set down her pen, feeling a flush of embarrassment she had not expected. "I did not think it so obvious." "It is not obvious to most, perhaps, but I have come to know you well enough these past months to notice." William's expression remained kind, carrying none of the wounded jealousy she might have feared. "I will be honest with you, Alina, because I believe our friendship deserves nothing less. I have grown fond of you, genuinely fond, in a way that could perhaps have grown into something more, given time and encouragement. But I do not believe that encouragement would ever come honestly from you, not while some part of your heart remains occupied with unfinished business from your marriage." Alina felt a rush of gratitude for his honesty, and something like relief that the question, unspoken between them for months, had finally been given proper voice. "You deserve someone whose heart is entirely free to offer you, William. I am not certain that person is me, not yet, and perhaps not ever, though I value our friendship more than I know how to properly express. Then I will simply say this, as a friend rather than anything more. Whatever you decide about the Duke, decide it because it is genuinely what you want, not out of obligation to the years you already gave him, and not out of pity for the effort he has clearly made these past months. You have built a life entirely your own, Alina. Whatever comes next should only add to that life, never diminish it." His words stayed with her through the following weeks, echoing the very sentiment Charlotte had offered Nathaniel without either of them, knowing the other had said something so similar. And Alina found herself, at last, ready to answer honestly the question she had been quietly weighing since that spring evening in the garden. She wrote to Nathaniel in late winter, asking him to visit Thornfield, and when his carriage arrived on a clear, cold afternoon nearly a year and a half after she had first left Kentmore Hall, she met him not in the shop, but in the small garden behind Henry's house, where the first snowdrops of the season had just begun pushing through the frozen ground. "You wish to see me," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying the careful uncertainty that had become familiar to her over these many months of small letters and small gestures. "I have thought a great deal about what you asked me at the gala," Alina said, standing among the snowdrops with her hands clasped before her, her composure steady despite the significance of the moment. "About whether there might be room in the life I have built for a man willing to earn back what he threw away." "And what have you decided?" She studied him for a long moment, this man who had once been unable to give her his whole heart, who had spent a year and a half proving, through patient, unglamorous effort, that he had genuinely become someone different from the closed, guarded man she had married. She thought of the rose cuttings that now grew steadily in her own small garden, of the careful, undemanding letters exchanged through his mother, of his genuine interest in her shop, and his equally genuine respect for the boundaries she had set. "I have decided," she said slowly, "that I am willing to consider it. Not a return to what we had before, Nathaniel, because that marriage is gone, and I have no wish to resurrect it exactly as it was. But perhaps something new, built honestly between two people who have both changed considerably, if you are willing to build it with me as an equal partner, rather than a duke and his duchess performing the roles society expects of them." Relief and hope broke across his face in equal measure, and he reached into his coat, producing a small box he had carried with him, though he did not open it immediately, seeming to understand, even now, that the moment required patience rather than presumption. "I do not carry this expecting an immediate answer," he said carefully. "I carry it only to show you that I understand what I am asking and what it would mean should you ever be ready to accept it. This is not the ring that belonged to my grandmother, Alina. I had a new one made, months ago, because I understood even then that if you ever chose to return to me, it should not be as an inheritance passed down through obligation, but as something chosen freely, meant only for you." He opened the box, and inside sat a simple, elegant ring, nothing like the heavy, ornate piece she had returned to him that afternoon in his study so long ago, but something lighter, finer, clearly chosen with careful thought for her own particular taste rather than family tradition. Alina looked at the ring for a long moment, then up at Nathaniel's face, at the genuine hope and equally genuine patience written there. A man willing to wait as long as necessary rather than pressing her toward an answer she was not yet ready to give. "Ask me again in the spring," she said finally, a small smile touching her lips for the first time that afternoon. "When the roses bloom again, along the wall where we first spoke honestly to each other. If you are still the man standing before me now, patient and honest and willing to build something new rather than reclaim something old, I believe my answer will be yes." Nathaniel closed the box gently and slipped it back into his coat, his own smile matching hers, quiet and genuine and full of a hope neither of them had expected to feel again after that terrible afternoon so long ago. "Then I will count the days until spring," he said, "and I will spend every one of them proving myself worthy of the answer I hope to hear." Spring returned to the county in its own unhurried time, and with it came the roses along the garden wall at Kentmore Hall, climbing thick and fragrant over stone that had witnessed, the previous year, a conversation neither Alina nor Nathaniel had expected to change the course of their lives so completely. Nathaniel kept his word. He arrived at Thornfield on the first morning the roses at Kentmore bloomed fully, carrying with him not the small box from their winter meeting, but simply himself, and the quiet, steady devotion he had spent a year and a half proving through patient, honest effort rather than empty promises. Alina met him in the same small garden behind Henry's house, and this time, when he asked the question properly, kneeling among the snowdrop's successors, the early tulips just beginning to open in the warm spring light, she did not ask him to wait any longer. She said yes, simply and honestly, and the ring he had chosen so carefully found its home on her finger at last, not as an inheritance or an obligation, but as something freely given and freely accepted between two people who had each, in their own difficult way, learned what it truly meant to love without fear. They did not rush toward a grand wedding, choosing instead a small, quiet ceremony at Kentmore Hall's own chapel, attended only by family and the closest of friends. Charlotte stood beside Alina as she had promised, teasing her gently even as tears stood plainly in her own eyes. Henry walked his sister down the short aisle a second time, no trace of the earlier anger he had carried on her behalf, only genuine happiness for the life she had chosen this time with her eyes fully open. Margaret wept openly through the entire ceremony, unashamed of tears she had waited a long while to shed, and Frederick, standing near the back of the small chapel, allowed himself a rare, satisfied smile at having played some small part in bringing this particular story to its proper conclusion. The marriage that followed bore little resemblance to the one that had come before it. Elinor kept her shop in Thornfield, traveling between the two houses as her work required, and Nathaniel, rather than expecting her to abandon what she had built, took genuine pride in supporting its continued growth, investing in the expansion of her workshop, and introducing her fine embroidery work to connections throughout London society that brought her trade further recognition than she had ever imagined possible. Grace and Alice Whitmore remained her trusted partners in the growing business, and within 2 years, the shop that had begun in a dusty, abandoned building in a small village had become known throughout the region as one of the finest establishments of its kind. Nathaniel, for his part, continued the work he had begun in the difficult months after Elinor's departure, remaining genuinely engaged with the estate's tenants and their concerns in a way his father never had, and the careful, honest partnership he and Elinor built together extended beyond their marriage into the running of Kentmore Hall itself. She managed the household accounts once more, though now as a genuine partner in every decision rather than a decoration expected to remain quietly in the background. And their evenings, once filled with careful silence and unspoken distance, now carried the easy warmth of two people who had learned, through considerable difficulty, how to speak honestly with one another about everything that mattered. Margaret lived to see her first grandchild born the following spring, a daughter they named after her, and she spent her final years surrounded by a warmth in that great house she had feared, during the darkest months of her son's first marriage, she might never live to witness. William Carter remained a valued friend to them both, his fabric supplying Elinor's shop for years to come, and he eventually found happiness of his own with a widow from the market town, a match that brought Elinor genuine joy when she learned of it, grateful that the honesty between them had preserved a friendship worth keeping rather than souring it with unspoken regret. Nathaniel visited Larkspur once more, the spring after his second wedding, this time with Elinor beside him, and together they stood before Beatrice's grave, no longer a place of hidden grief, but simply a quiet corner of his past he no longer needed to visit alone. He had told Elinor everything, in the months of their renewed courtship, every detail he had once kept locked away, and she had listened without jealousy, understanding in her own hard-won wisdom that a heart capable of grieving so deeply was also a heart capable, eventually, of loving fully again, once it finally learned to stop being afraid of what that love might cost. Years later, when their eldest daughter asked her mother, as children eventually do, how her parents had come to marry, Elinor would tell the story simply, without bitterness, the way one tells a story that has, despite its difficult chapters, arrived at genuine happiness in the end. She would speak of a young woman who signed papers without tears not because her heart was unmoved, but because she had already learned that tears change nothing, and that dignity, quietly kept, could carry a person further than grief ever could. She would speak of a man who mistook mercy for cowardice, and who spent a long, difficult year learning the difference, proving through patient honesty rather than empty promises that people can, indeed, change, if they are willing to do the harder work such change requires. And she would tell her that the ring on her finger, the one her daughter loved to turn in the candlelight and watch catch the glow, had not been chosen from old family tradition or handed down through obligation, but had been chosen freely, by a man who understood, finally, that love worth having must be earned honestly, one patient season at a time, rather than assumed as a matter of duty or title. The gardens at Kentmore Hall bloomed each spring after that with a particular abundance the old gardeners swore they had never seen before, roses climbing thick along every wall, and those who remembered the quiet, difficult years of the first marriage often remarked, in the careful way such things are discussed among old friends, that the house itself seemed to have finally found its proper warmth, as though it, too, had simply been waiting all along for its duke and duchess to learn how to love each other honestly, rather than merely dutifully, and had bloomed in quiet celebration once they finally did.